right, so getting back to the Calla, this is pretty much one of the nicest designs I do at this point in time, and probably takes me close to 2 days, 2 full days to do a Calla lily set. The Calla lilies are all one piece except for the stamen there. That's forge brazed in. There's my forge, fairly basic. I primarily do coal. And there's the mess that is my shop. Okay, starting off, we're going to discuss material choices. And the most common being mild steel, or as we all know it, A36. And when you're talking about handles, A36 is going to be your most forgeable material, steel-wise. It's certainly the cheapest, and it's pretty much the strongest. Really, the only downside is the potential for rust as a handle material. But if you beeswax it and take care of it and don't leave your utensils to sit in the sink, you shouldn't have any problems with rusting. The only time I have any problems with the utensils I use at home rusting is when I'm lazy and leave them sitting in the sink. Otherwise, I pretty much almost never see any rust on them. And I probably haven't re-waxed any of them in the 10 or 15 years I've been using them. As far as using mild steel for the ends, it's perfectly good for spatula blades if you have a nice thickness. If you want to use it for spoons or ladle bowls, you're going to have to dish it hot. And keep in mind that, again, rust is going to be an issue. When you're talking about mild steel for the ends, you're not going to be able to really maintain a wax finish on those because they're what's coming in contact with the heat more often than not. And I don't know that the beeswax won't melt off in the food and look funky. I don't think there's any problem as far as it being food safe, but if you're stirring something and then all of a sudden you see this little trail of wax melting off into your soup or something, it might be a bit of a turnoff. There are oils, food oils you could use if you season everything like you would a cast iron pan. But my feeling is that the maintenance on those is going to get to be a pain in the butt over time. It's just, they're going to be a higher maintenance utensil when you start using mild steel for the spatula blades or the ladle bowls. So, okay, and we'll move on here. Excuse me. Stainless steel. Stainless steel there's kind of a love-hate relationship with stainless steel. It's great for corrosion resistance. It's considerably stronger than mild steel. It looks really nice if you have a more modern kitchen. If somebody's got all stainless finished appliances, it'll go really nicely in that kind of a kitchen. So hold on, before I continue on with materials, I just want to throw in my perspective that I'm presenting is primarily from a working smith perspective. So all of my considerations at this point in history are whether or not these are going to sell, whether or not people are going to like them, whether or not they're going to go well in somebody's kitchen, and appealing to as many different kinds of clients as I can. I've done some all stainless utensils. And as you can see under the cons, stainless is a lot harder to forge. If you don't have a power hammer, it's almost not worth trying because it forges a lot harder than mild, and you can wind up with hot shuts. And when you wind up with a hot shut, you'll wind up with rust. when you forge stainless, you lose the corrosion resistance, and you then have to go back and refinish it, whether you passivate it in acid or you abrade it with belt sanders and whatnot, in order to eliminate the iron oxides that have accumulated on the surface. So there's considerably more labor in the finishing process. You also can't work it as hot. If you get it too hot, it'll crack on you, and that's called hot shortness. So you've got the double sort of whammy of it's already harder to forge, and you have to work it a little colder. So it's challenging. And like I said, I don't really recommend it if you don't have a power hammer, but if you're game, give it a try. It's good for the experience at least once to see what it feels like. Material wise, it is more money, but it's not going to be a huge prohibitively expensive, because you're going to raise the price, and the overall price of the material compared to the increased labor isn't going to be that big a problem. As far as stainless for the ends, the bowls, the spatula blades, it's the only material I use for my spatula blades. Because it's so much tougher than mild, you can get a really thin sheet cross-section for a really nice thin blade and still maintain strength without it wanting to bend every time you go to use it. It's got a lot of good springiness. If you want to use it for your spoons and your ladles, you're gonna have to dish it hot. There's just no two ways around it. You're gonna barely get much movement out of stainless steel sheet dishing wise if you do it cold. It'll bounce, your hammer will bounce, and it'll just laugh at you. It's not pretty. So trying to think if I have anything else I want to add to that. Well, okay, so a little bit more about the finishing. If you decide to go for passivating, then you have to decide which acid you want to use. And now you're bringing more chemicals into your shop if you're not already using them. And then you have to deal with the safety equipment necessary for dealing with acids. And then you have to deal with appropriately getting rid of the acid once it's spent, and it's a hazardous waste product. So I'm lucky in that my local county landfill has free household hazardous waste days, and it's nearby, so I can get rid of pretty much all the acid. I don't use much, but I can get rid of it for free. But disposal could be a problem for people. So and I think that covers it. I'm going to check in with Paul. Paul, anybody have any pressing questions thus far?
No, there were some questions earlier about stainless steel and rusting, but I think you covered that to everybody's satisfaction.
Okay, so, great.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on. Bronze. Ooh. I love bronze. It's beautiful. Bronze should be fine with food. I'll go into the whole copper oxide potential metal poisoning issue here in a second. The only downside to bronze, it's trickier to forge. It's a little bit more temperamental, and I kind of treat it like copper. I forge it at about a good solid red, and when it starts to get cold, I stop. I don't want to risk hammering on it too cold, and I really don't want to risk hammering it too hot. It'll fall apart on you. It pretty much just disintegrates if you overheat it. That's the downside, or one of the downsides. So you really got to proceed carefully, especially if you're going to use a coal forge. If you have a gas forge with a thermostat, then you just set your number and to the forging range, and you're good to go. Bronze is going to tarnish, and it's going to tarnish fairly quickly. I usually have to go back over all the utensils in my inventory for my farmers markets. Every farmers market, I wind up having to break out the Scotch-Brite pads and take off the fingerprints from the previous farmers market where everybody likes to handle everybody wants to touch it. Everybody wants to, they want to do this to the spoon bowl, and then they leave their fingerprints. So, and the cost. Bronze is considerably more expensive than mild steel, probably a good 10 times more expensive, and that's not exaggerating. I don't use much of it, so luckily the overall cost per utensil is relatively low. But when I started using it, I bumped up the price of the utensils by $5 to $10 to compensate. Using it for the ends, it's pretty good for pretty much all the ends. I'll go into the spatulas in a second. It's tougher. I forge it, or when I'm using bronze for ladles and spoons, I anneal it. I don't dish it hot, and it doesn't anneal as soft as copper, and it will work harden a little quicker on you. So you'll wind up annealing the ends more frequently to get to your final point, your final disc shape, than you would with, say, copper. Copper, you anneal it 2 or 3 times, and it's so soft you can just about crumple it in your hand. But bronze, you'll see the difference when you start hammering on it. Even when it's annealed, it's just simply a tougher, stronger material. Aesthetically, we have the wow factor. I used to use brass for my skimmers, and I've never been a huge fan of brass. And I had been planning on going to bronze for years. I just needed to get set the money aside to invest in enough bronze to carry me through. The luster and the color of bronze, I think, is a significantly more attractive look than brass. I mean, I've never really been a fan of brass even before I got into blacksmithing, but bronze, everybody I've gotten feedback from when I sell at the farmers markets, they love the bronze. I've never had anybody say anything negative about the look of the bronze. So the cons, or the sort of the things you have to be careful of. Bronze is a copper alloy, and with all copper alloys, if you leave them in high acid foods, usually tomato-based products, salsas and sauces, tomato sauces, things of that nature, you can get a little bit of a metallic taste to the food. And it's not going to kill anybody, but it can make it taste metallic, and it'll taste gross. So when people buy any of my utensils, there's a little card. It's about 1.5 by 1.5 inch square cardboard card that has an image of the utensils on one side and then care instructions on the other. And those care instructions include: do not leave copper utensils in high acid foods, as it can cause a metallic taste. For spatulas, bronze isn't the most practical. It doesn't wear as well. It's not as tough as stainless steel. It's going to show scratches and gouges a lot more, and I think the resulting look is going to be considerably less attractive as it wears in over time. And in order to get the bronze to a work hardened enough state that it's got the springiness that I personally like in my spatula blades, you're going to have to hammer on the whole piece. And if you're going to do that, you're going to want to make sure that your hammer marks are consistent for the whole piece, so that it's really looking intentional and not just like you beat the hell out of it. Even though you are going to beat the hell out of it, you want it to really have an intentional look to it. And I tried it once or twice. I tried it with one, and I just didn't like the look. It wasn't a clean look. You can get a clean look, you can planish the whole piece, but now you're going to have to have a highly polished hammer and a highly polished plate underneath. So, and ultimately it's still just a little softer. So there's a good chance that when you start flexing your spatula blade in a pan and trying to get it under food, you're going to bend it and it's not going to spring back. So that's pretty much my feelings on bronze. And if nothing's pressing, then I will, I assume
We had a
if
couple of
anybody has
questions. We had a couple of
Okay,
questions with
go
regard
ahead. Yeah.
to the bronze. Do you have
Yeah.
issues with the material thinning and cracking when you're dishing it or heating it?
No, and towards the end of the presentation, I talk about dishing and the options, and the different tooling options will explain why or how you avoid cracking issues.
While we're at it, on cracking, could you define what a hot shunt is, how it comes about?
Oh,
And
a hot shot is when the force of the blow doesn't fully penetrate deeply enough into the material, and you wind up with more of a surface or localized sort of an upset, usually near the edge. And what happens is it then starts to fold over. A hot shot is really like a little tiny fold.
like
And
fish
once you
lips?
start, pardon?
Like fish lips?
Yes, like fish lips. If people know what fish lips are, when you're hammering on a piece and it's not, either the hammer's not heavy enough or it's a tool steel, you're only moving the material closest to the surface. And what can happen, say with a piece of stainless, when you're hammering, I've had this happen when I hammer on the edges to break the edges. Most of us probably know what breaking our corners are. Well, the corners don't forge, even hot, the corners don't forge down necessarily cleanly. It winds up spreading a little bit locally and then folding over onto the adjacent surfaces. And those folds now trap material underneath that if you don't file or grind it out, you'll never get those oxides clean out from under. So you'll wind up with a line of rust, in stainless at least. And if you keep working, that shut will travel into the material and become a crack.
While we're talking about stainless, what sort of size of stock would you recommend somebody who is feeling adventurous and wants to pick up doing forging a 304 stainless?
Hold on one second. I'm going to adjust my light here a little bit. I would start with 3/8 round, which is when I teach this class in person. I start the students with 3/8 round, so I would start with that. I use in my shop, I use 1/4 by 1/2, and that sort of came about accidentally because I had a whole bunch of 1/4 by 1/2 scrap that I had raided from somebody else's scrap pile, and that was mild steel. And I had it for so long, I got so frustrated that I figured out I had to figure out something to do with all this stuff. So I designed my kitchen utensils to be able to use 1/4 by 1/2. And it wasn't until I started teaching the class that I thought starting students with a 3/8 round would be a little bit of an easier place for them to start.
So last question on bronze, is that silicon bronze? Is it 650?
Yes, the bronze I use is silicon bronze. I haven't used aluminum bronze. I can't speak to if there's any other issues with silicon bronze, whether it's food safe or whether it's softer or tougher or how it finishes. You really have to do some research on that. But silicon bronze, I think that was just what somebody else had recommended to me or what I had heard.
Well, it certainly is the most common sort of bronze for forging purposes.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on. Copper. Copper is really only appropriate for the ends. It's considerably too soft for a handle. It forges really easily, and as far as for a handle goes, even in a fully work hardened state, I feel it's going to be too soft, and you're going to wind up bending the utensil handle. It's never going to have the kind of resistance and springiness that you get from mild steel or even bronze. Bronze is considerably the difference between copper and bronze is analogous to the difference between mild steel and tool steel. So if you know what it's like to go from mild steel to tool steel, that's similar to what it's like to go from copper to bronze. Although bronze is considerably softer than tool steel, but that's very much what it's like. Okay, so the copper oxide question. I've done research and I've talked to people in food science, and after discussion and reading, the main issue with copper is when you're cooking on bare copper. Say you have a copper frying pan and there's no coating on it. Now your food is in direct contact with the copper, and the other side of that is in direct contact with the heat. So that direct heat contact is what's going to create the oxides on the food side, and that's when it's not safe. That's when the oxides can leach into the food and start to become unsafe. When you're just stirring or serving, you're not directly heating the copper on the utensil, so you're not going to produce the same levels of oxides, and the food isn't in contact with it nearly long enough for it to be a problem. The worst problem you're going to have is a metallic taste with high acid foods. And in the 20 plus years I've been selling, I've only ever once had somebody come back to me and say they could taste the copper in anything they used it on. And when I kind of quizzed the young woman, her parents had bought the utensil. And as it turned out, both her parents and she could taste the copper, no matter what they used it on. So I kind of surmised it was probably essentially a genetic sensitivity, that they were all just really sensitive to the taste of it. I have a copper ladle at home, and I use it on occasion, and I've sipped from it, and I can't taste the copper at all. So that being said, if people are really still concerned, you can tin the copper. I don't personally care for the look, but you got to be comfortable with what you're making. So you got to do what you feel is best. There are tinning compounds out there. I'm not going to I won't go into the process. I've never done it, so I can't explain it a whole lot. It's like brazing the surface, but with tin, or soldering the surface, the inside, the food contact areas with tin. And there are compounds out there that that come with the flux mixed in. I think Amy Pei carries it. I Googled it last night, and there are plenty of videos out there for how to tin copper. So what it comes down to is you don't want to cook directly on bare copper. Serving, stirring, you're not going to have any problems as far as safety goes. You never want to cook directly on bare copper. And so the only other thing about copper is it's kind of pricey, and the saving grace as far as the cost is, you don't need a whole lot of it. A 3x3 sheet for me, I make at least a couple dozen utensils a year. A 3x3 sheet can probably last me 2 or 3 years on an average year, not a pandemic year, but an average year when I haven't been to a farmer's market to sell my stuff since last year. So a little goes a long way. Anything pressing, Paul? How are we doing? Everybody still awake, I hope? Thanks, Bill. Okay, material sizing. So let me take a sip of tea here. This is more talking than I've done in probably months. And talking to myself, I think, doesn't count. So I like to make sure that the stock that I'm using for the various utensil ends is thick enough to not just hold shape, but it's not too springy. It's not gonna flex too much, except for, of course, the spatulas. For the bronze ladles and spoons and skimmers, I use 042, 42 thousandths of an inch. For copper, I use 042. Copper is generally measured in ounces, so that translates to a 32 ounce. I think that's per square, might be per square foot. I'm not entirely sure. And it'll give you, when you buy sheet products, they won't give you a specific thickness measurement. They give you a range that a particular gauge or a particular ounce will give you. So in stainless, I buy 24 gauge, and that's going to give me anything anywhere from 22 thousandths to 24 thousandths. So they only guarantee you plus or minus 2 thousandths or 4 thousandths. So for barbecue spatulas, if you want to go a little thicker, you can go up to 30 thousandths. You might be surprised at just what a difference that extra 6 to 8 thousandths will make. I still use the 24 gauge for my barbecue spatulas personally. I like the little bit of flex. The 30 thousandths for me is still too stiff and will act more as a scraper than it will an actual spatula. And then, but again, that's part of that is, it's personal preference. Customers that I've had seem to like the thinner, more flexible stainless blades on the spatulas. So, and if you're looking to buy in your area, all I can tell you is Google, dealers, and then call them, tell them what thousandths of an inch you're looking for, and then they'll tell you what gauge will get you in that neighborhood. So, okay, well, move on here. Design and construction options. All right, let's see what we've got here. All right, there's pretty much just two categories you can break kitchen utensils down into. You got one piece and two piece. One piece I see more in older colonial American style, although I know Joe Anderson has done some really fun stuff with one-piece utensils. It's really tricky to do without a power hammer. It's a lot of peening and it's a lot of thinning, and it's harder to sometimes get the surface area you want to get a ladle bowl just the right size. You got to play around a lot with what stock you're going to start with to get to where you want to go. So, and for me, I really like the mixing of the metals. I like the look of it. I think it's just a more attractive look. And if your tooling is a little bit limited, it's a lot easier to do a two-piece than it is a one-piece. And if you're not a 25-year-old kid who doesn't mind standing around hammering for 2 hours to thin a piece out, then the two-piece is also easier on your shoulders and your elbows. So, but the colonial, Peter Ross does some beautiful colonial spatulas. I suggest you check them out if you haven't yet. He does amazing work. So, and with the two-piece, the rivets can come into play. With the stainless spatulas, I use brass rivets. It's the only time I use brass, though if I could find bronze rivets, I would switch to bronze rivets. And again, it's easier with limited tooling. You can do a two-piece with hammer, anvil, and hand tools, even some power hand tools, a hand drill, and a pair of tin snips. So, it's a lot easier to do if you're a hobbyist at home with who doesn't have a whole lot to them. Okay, next up here. And and just an aside, if you get a chance, Google Joe Anderson or find some of his work. He does some really fun utensils. He was my inspiration to start all of this. Handle design considerations. This is a tool, and as we all know, the first consideration for a tool is functionality. You don't want it to be too heavy. You don't want somebody to pick this up and get tired of using it too quickly, and it's got to feel right. That's really the first consideration. How does this feel? And I've seen people pick up my utensils on occasion, and they do this to it, and they seem to like that little bit of resistance. Plastic has no weight to it. It feels weird to me. I don't know about anybody else. Aluminum, the same thing. It's too light. There's no heft, as people say. So the weight took me a couple of years to stop making my kitchen utensils that were coming out more like clubs that were too heavy. But that's a very common beginner thing, is you make everything too heavy, too thick. Remember, steel has some of the best strength per cross section than most any other material. Length, it's kind of really what you want, but I suggest you err on making a utensil that's a little too long. I tend to make mine anywhere from 10 to 14 inches, depending upon the utensil. The ladles I tend to make the longest, and the skimmers, because you're talking about reaching either over hot oil or into a larger pot of soup. And if a utensil is a little too long, worst comes to worst, you take half a step back. But if it's too short, now you've got your hand or your arm further over a heat source, and that's never comfortable. That's especially true with barbecue tools. I make sure my barbecue tools, I mean, I do some shorter ones. You know, somebody out there still has a hibachi, but I think if you err on too long, you can't go wrong. Nobody's going to complain, you know, unless you make a 2-foot ladle. That's a whole nother thing. Grip comfort. You got to hold this. This has got to be held for some time. You want to make sure your edges are fairly soft. When I make my handles, after I'm done forging everything, I'll hold it and make sure that there aren't any either burrs, or that the edges of the handle are relatively rounded off. I'll hammer and break the edges a little bit. If there's any kind of a design element, whether it's the Calla lily, or a leaf, or even the little scroll tail I do, I make sure that it's flat and not going to be in the way or be uncomfortable. You'll see the Calla lily set again later at the end of the presentation, and you can see that the flower head is about 4 inches down in the middle of the utensil, so there's very little chance, of somebody gripping that while they're actually using the utensil. So again, this is a tool, and it's got to be comfortable to use. And you know, if you're making it for yourself, you want to make sure it's not going to hurt your hand. I think that basically covers, you know, after you take all your functional considerations, the rest is all whatever you can get away with. Really, design is, you know, use your own imagination. What I'm showing you here is my approach, my designs, how I like to make them. So, you know, have fun. Do your own stuff. You can see the picture here. Just a couple of pictures on the handle designs. The scroll tail on the left. We've got some quarters there for scale. And then if you look you see that on the right with the leaf, that leaf wraps around, and that's primarily a comfort thing. Those leaves are bigger than that space there, and I like the leaf to come down a little bit, so I wrap it to make sure that it's not going to be a problem. And the only potential spot, if you folks can see the mouse or can see the arrow, this little corner here, you just want to make sure that's not too sharp. That's generally the only time I come close to a problem with the leaf wrap. All right, some more pictures. This is one of the 3 spatula blade shapes I use. It's also the one that you'll see me make a little bit later here in the presentation. It's an off-sided lobe spatula. For me at home, it's the shape I use most. I do a lot of cooking in a small cast iron pan, and this tends to be a perfect size for working in a small pan. There's a close-up of the calla lily, and you can see it's midway on the handle, so there's no chance of somebody gripping that, because this little tip here, even if you get it fairly radiused, is still small and can get uncomfortable if you catch your thumb or something on it. All right, we'll get into some ladle and spoon designs. Let me check with Paul. Do we have any questions? How's everybody doing?
Well, there was a question earlier about sources, and maybe we can cover that kind of toward the end, if
Okay.
there's time. You know, where
Sources
do you find copper? Where do you find bronze? Where do you find stainless steel sheets? Where do you look for drops?
Okay, yeah, we can go through. I can touch on that again a little bit later. Ladle and spoon designs. So the first ladles I started to make were your basic hemisphere, and I started with about a 4-inch circle, and that yielded about a 3 3/4 inch diameter hemisphere. And then I eventually moved up to a 4.5 inch diameter to give me a slightly larger volume. Again, functionality, unless somebody specifically wants a small ladle, I like to make sure, I assume these are going to be used for things like soup. If you need a smaller one, like maybe a gravy ladle, then definitely, make it a little bit smaller. But I want to make sure for marketability that people can get a reasonable amount, that it's got a good volume. And I just found, for making a template, I found a paint can that had a diameter at the bottom of it was just about the size I needed, and traced around it. It's not rocket science, so it's pretty easy. And okay, so the egg shape or the oval, well, the excuse me, hold on. The egg shape would be more of the spoon if you had an egg with 2 small lobes on either side. That would be that, and you'll see those in a second here, the other style of ladle I do. And I started with a 4-inch round and then ovaled out on either side of the circle. The reason I started with a 4-inch round was to make sure that the volume was approximately the same as the hemispherical ladle bowls. I wanted people to be able to choose a ladle based on their own, on the aesthetics, rather than just strictly the functionality. So I made sure that they both had the same good amount of volume. If you develop your own ladle shapes, definitely experiment. And I may have to stand up here in a minute, but I've got a book that I used to, I'm gonna stand up here for a second, see if I can see the book off the top of mine. I put it aside, and of course I put it aside a second time. Not sure where it is. When you go from flat to 3D, things change. So the shape you think you're going to wind up with isn't necessarily the shape you start out with, or vice versa. The shape you start out with is not going to be the shape you wind up with. So, except obviously for the hemisphere, you start with round, you wind up with round. But when you start with oval and you start dishing it, I went through 2 or 3 different iterations of my sort of double oval ladle in order to get a nice smooth transition. And I'll show you, or I'll explain that a little bit more when that picture comes up. So just keep in mind, there's gonna be a lot of experimentation, a lot of changes that you're gonna have to make until you figure out what you need to do to make your flat template turn into the 3D shape that you want. So don't be discouraged the first couple of times if you make it and you look at it and go, wait a minute, that's completely not what I thought I was going to wind up with.
So if you want to end up with a oval shaped, like your ladle, with the lips on either end, do you start off with a round piece of stock?
Well, I started with the round, and then in line with the diameter, or in line with the center, I made essentially, is anybody out there not know what a cam looks like? Anybody, Paul, not familiar with? Tell Paul if you don't know what a cam looks like.
A what?
A cam.
A cam. Like a camshaft. The lobe on a cam.
Well, also a cross section of an egg.
Right. But imagine instead of one minor lobe, you had 2 minor lobes on either side of the larger section in the center. It's kind of hard. I didn't anticipate having to go into this that much. I should. For future, what we'll do is we'll have pictures of my templates. But I started with sort of a double oval egg shape. And when I dished it, the center section bulged in a way. The profile, or the rim of the bowl did this wave thing that I then had to figure out what it was about the template that I needed to alter in order to get the rim to be smooth. When I click over a couple of times, and when you'll see that picture in a little bit here, and hopefully I can explain that a little bit better if it's not coming across too easily. And again, experiment, play. Keep in mind any funky shapes you want to turn into a ladle bowl, go for it. Just remember, it's got to pour and it's got to hold, and you want it to hold a reasonable amount of liquid. So have fun with it. Get weird. All right, so here you see the 4 ladles, see the 2 hemispheres, and the 2 sort of what I double oval. And what I started with was a 4.5-inch circle, and then sort of drew out 2 lobes on either side. I hope that's making more sense now. And the original template, when I was done dishing the original template, this line here wasn't a nice clean arc. It had this funky sort of bump in the middle and dipped down because of the way the shape changed when going from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. So I had to alter the template and play with the template and change the line to compensate for the movement of the material later on. I hope that answers the question, or that hopefully that explains it a little bit better. You can see I put 2 spouts on my ladles. I'm left-handed, and I know several other left-handed smiths, and I like to make sure. And since you don't know who's going to buy it, I put one on either side, so it's a nice little consideration. People seem to appreciate it. I know my fellow left-handers do. And then I'm gonna give me 2 seconds. Okay. On the far right, you see an all stainless spoon. The rivets are all stainless as well. That was a bit of a bear to make. And I did all the finish work before assembly. And along the edge, you can see the edge here is broken. And that's where I wound up with some hot shuts. The force of the blow didn't really penetrate deeply enough, so it just wound up folding the material over a little bit. And I wound up going back with a file and probably even on my belt sander later on, taking some of that off so that I could, because I wound up with a few, they'll look like just little thin lines, but of rust. And stainless steel rivets, you got to set them cold, and those are not a whole lot of fun to set. Even 1/8" stainless steel rivets, setting those cold is a pain. So, all right, moving on. More shots of the. I think this is bronze, based on the hue of it. And with the bronze utensils, I use copper rivets. It matches the color the closest. Again, I've not found bronze rivets. It'd be nice. Close up of the hemisphere. Spoons are a lot easier. There's not nearly the same amount of dishing involved. And with copper, unless you're going to go for a super deep dish, one annealing should be fine. The material generally comes a little work hardened from the mill, so you won't necessarily get as much movement or as deep a dish as you want without annealing. So I anneal the material right away rather than try to get a little bit of movement on it and then wind up annealing it, finishing it, and still having it not work hardened enough when I'm done, because I want to make sure, since copper's soft, you have to plan out that the copper ends are going to be fully work hardened when you're done shaping them. If you have to go back and anneal it to get just a little bit more movement out of it, a little bit more shape, you can wind up with an end that's too soft, and then you have to go through work hardening it and hammering on it and trying to make sure you don't actually wind up deforming it. You wind up overworking it. Here's my skimmers. This is bronze. The biggest, or all the labor is drilling. All those holes have to be drilled individually and deburred. Again, you want to make sure for safety you don't leave burrs on anything anybody's going to potentially be sipping or eating from. I know when I cook, I taste, or if I've got something in a pan, I scrape a little out of the pan and wind up eating right off the spatula. I think we've all enjoyed pan scrapings from now and again. All right, spatula designs. Over time, excuse me here, I'm not used to sitting quite this much, so I'm going to stretch a little bit. Spatula designs evolved over time. One of the considerations for me was time, how much time I could spend on any one design. If I had too many designs, then I'm spending too much time cutting out parts, and I have to take into consideration overhead. So I went with the simpler ones and the ones I knew were selling. You can see on the right. I gotta move something. Excuse me for a second. So the one on the bottom right, that is a traditional keyhole shape, and I altered it a little bit over time to make this bottom section. My cursor doesn't. This bottom section here on the traditional one is much smaller, and at first when I made them more along the lines of a traditional design, I didn't sell any of them. There just wasn't enough surface area. So I wound up lengthening and widening this, and I sold a few, but I never sold enough to justify continue making them. So the one on the left on the bottom, and then the one on the right, and the one on the top are the two I've stuck with, because they've proved the most popular with my customers. When you're cutting these out, whether you're using a bevelly shear or you're using tin snips or any kind of a snip, the concave or the inside angles and lines are going to be the hardest. So this section here, let me just check in. Are people seeing me, the cursor? Paul, can they see the cursor? Okay, thanks, Bill. I just want to make sure that I'm not sitting here thinking people are seeing things that.
Yeah, we're seeing the
Okay, great,
cursor.
great.
That's fine.
Okay.
One note here.
Yes, sir.
We're at around slide 30 out of 110, and we're at
so
an hour. We
quicker.
are an hour into this.
Oh, I'll move. Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. No, definitely. I don't want to be here till 9. We all have the rest of the evening to do. Bill's good for it though. Okay. So cutting out these inside curves here gets a little trickier. So you got to pay a little more attention. All right. Let's move on. I'll try not to spend so much time. All right. Here's some more pictures, front and the back. That's my standard barbecue. I used to use some of the other shapes, but bigger. But again, it's just for barbecue, I thought it was overkill. People are mainly just flipping burgers, and this is a whole lot easier and quicker to make. And you can see the brass rivets. So I think we've been checking it often enough. So unless somebody has something pressing, I'll just move on. All right, the pattern. Here's me cutting out the pattern. This is the beginning, tracing the pattern using a Sharpie. This line across here gets buffed out later. It's not a scratch. It's just sort of a scuff. You can't feel it. If you can feel a scratch with your fingernail, it's probably too deep. Toss the piece and start over with a cleaner section. You want to keep it straight and flat. If you get little dings, they can be near impossible to take out cleanly. When you're cutting material, essentially what this is really supposed to show is that you're not supposed to cut to the very end of the blade. Whether it's on tin snips or bevelly shears, you cut through and you stop short. If you go all the way to the end, you'll wind up dinging the material past the point of cutting, like when you're cutting with scissors and you wind up with a jagged edge on a piece of paper. So avoid cutting to the very end of the tip of the snips or the tip of the shear. So you see I'm taking small cuts, and I don't cut to the end of the blade. Bevelies are fairly versatile. You got to make sure they're adjusted properly. And you don't want to tweak too hard on especially on thin material. And always wear a glove when you're cutting sheet metal. The hand you're holding it, you can slice your hand open very easily on thin material, especially stainless or anything actually. I'm sure some of us have had that experience. I know I have, and it hurts. So you can see I've left those inside curves till last, till I free the piece. And here's, I think, the next video. Oh, hold on, we'll go back. So once I cut most of the waste away, then I come back in and start nibbling slowly away at that inside curve. And that's what I'm left with. Just a quick note, when you trace around and you see the line here, you see the Sharpie line. When you cut, you have pretty much, you have three options. You can leave your line, you can take the line, or you can cut through the middle of the line. I leave the line, and then I grind down to where the line to the point that the line is gone. That way, if I screw something up, I've got material to grind away. It's always, of course, easier to take material away than it is to put it back. So leave yourself room to screw up. Okay. So you see, I'm going to go back real quick. This is fairly rough. Lots of burrs, lots of opportunity to slice body parts open with. Next, and you'll see this in the video, I go to my belt grinder. I use a 60 grit as sort of my general for, and then I'll, excuse me. I generally use a 60 grit for all sort of multi-purpose material removal. If you don't have a belt grinder, you can use a file, use a fine tooth file. This is really thin material, and a file that's too coarse will just kind of vibrate the piece. It won't cut quite so cleanly. And then use sandpaper. I use about 100 grit if I have to use sandpaper after I've filed. To get the heavy burrs off, you're going to need at least a file, and then the 100 grit paper to start smoothing things up. And you'll see the video here in a second. I go to a Scotch-Brite wheel on a grinder. If you don't have that, you can use a hand pad. It'll take you a little while, but you really want that edge. You want to be able to lick the edge and not worry about getting cut, because again, it's a kitchen utensil, and we all take tastes and eat directly from a utensil at some point in time. Just excuse me, I had to find my cursor there. It disappears if I don't move it often. I use a lot of these Scotch-Brite balls. They're not, I don't think they're called Scotch-Brite balls per se, but I buy them at Harbor Freight. They're 10 bucks a piece, and they're great for doing the insides of the ladle bowls and the spoons and the skimmers. They're invaluable, and for 10 bucks a pop, they're the best. I usually use the brown or the maroon. They come in 3 grits. I usually use the coarsest grit. They're also sometimes referred to as goblet buffs. And you'll see in the video, you can put it in the drill press. They're rated for up to 3,000 RPM. I don't know that my drill goes to 3,000, but if you're using them, make sure you're not going past that. They're essentially plastic fiber, and you'll start melting and smearing the plastic all over the piece if you're going faster than 3,000. Here's me at the belt sander. Ideally, you really don't want to stand there, although this is just a still from the video. You don't want the edge going into the belt like that, generally, because it can grab, or it'll pull it out of your hand, and at minimum it'll tweak the piece. At worst, there'll be a burr that'll catch on your hand and cut your hand open. So let's see, I think the video is next. If you're gonna go along the face, take very, very light passes. The table here, it's really easy to get a thin piece have it get pulled down between the belt and the table. And at best, it'll just ruin the piece and you'll have to start over. At worst, it'll shoot it somewhere or pull it out of your hand. And again, cut your hand up, or it'll go sailing somewhere and you'll never find it. So safety is a big issue when you're dealing with the kind of RPMs and thin material. So you see I'm taking really light passes, and I'm working the edge of the belt, and I'm trying to keep the material pointed down, and I'm working pretty much below the midline of that wheel. So now at this point, I'm cleaning up the shape, and I'm taking the rest of that Sharpie line off. When I adjust the tracking on my belts, I leave just a little hair past the edge of the wheel so that I can do a little radius section if I have to. Next, after that, I use the Scotch-Brite wheel, and the Scotch-Brite wheel is what takes that edge to sort of a rolled or mild radius edge, and it's soft and very smooth to the touch. And I'm constantly running my fingers around the edge to make sure I don't have any rough spots or any burrs. Although by this time, all the burrs should be gone, and this is the final step as far as finishing the edge goes. The angle might look a little funky, but Greg is trying to make sure he gets the full view here. This space in my shop is a little tight at that spot. And then when I'm done with all of that, I'll use a hand pad and just sort of buff it out by hand and move it around in circles, so if there's any heavier scratches that I don't like, they get hidden. And here's the goblet buffs, and there'll be a video of those in a second. These have a little hex section just above the round section, and they tighten up, they chalk up really nice in a 3-jaw chuck. And there's a little screw in here. There's a slotted screw, so you can tighten that down if it starts to get too loose. Taking any last edge off that, or any last burrs or roughness off the edge. That's actually moving pretty fast. I know the video doesn't look like it, but that's the highest RPM that my drill press will go up to. And again, you see I'm not digging in, I'm not working in line, I'm gently just letting the ball work against the edge. When you use Scotch-Brite wheels and bows, you gotta wear breathing mask. The dust from these things is really pretty nasty. You don't want to be breathing the fiber dust from those things. Okay. There we go. Forging the handle. Okay, moving on to the real fun part here. These are the storyboards, front and back. This is technically, I need to redo these. This is technically the second step. First step is establishing this first flat here. This very first flat. When you're using, if you're using round stock and you're making a flat handle, well, the attachment end is, the tab there is flat. So you need to establish that first plane, and that's your first step essentially, is establishing that plane and then the second plane that you're working with. And there we go. You flatten the tip about a ½ inch back. Then you rotate the stock 90 degrees. Remember to leave that flattened tip off the edge of the anvil, and then establish your second plane. You're coming up pretty much right behind, you're setting a shoulder right behind that ½ inch flattened section. And that's usually the trickiest part. For most beginners, this is probably the most challenging part, is setting this boss down and getting this established. And it's the part, when I demo this in a live class, I usually wind up re-demoing this particular section throughout the weekend. All right, you establish the boss, you get the tab, that first ½ inch section, and you angle it off about 30 degrees, and you set the shoulder down. Excuse me, I'm gonna hope I don't lose my voice here. And you do that on both sides. And you'll see the video of that here in a little bit. This is the end result. And so the reason for that is when you do a plane change, you want sort of an intersection for strength. If you just did a plain old square shoulder where this meets this, you'd have a real weak spot. And since it's not uncommon for beginners to really have this tab be thinner than it really should be, you could risk that that's going to break off with time. So this little boss, as it's called, adds a lot of strength to that section. That's where all your stress is. Not that there's a lot of stress in kitchen utensils, but all right, and here we go, the forging process. Here's flattening the tip, all right, hanging it off the edge of the anvil, and I'm creeping right up on the edge of the anvil to set those shoulders, those first shoulders to differentiate between the two planes. Now coming off the first edge at about 30 degrees. And from there on in, it's refining that particular shape, forging that tab out a little bit wider, a little thinner. Okay, let me see if I'm, all right, here's from another angle, same video from a different angle, and hopefully you'll be able to see me setting that. You'll see me setting that tab. If you don't have clean edges on your anvil, then you may need to make an anvil block for your hardy hole. You can also use a little square set tool. Some people make dies to make that boss. Now I'm working it back, taking it to pretty much the final step, or the final shape that I want. If you haven't done much of it, drawing out over the horn can go a lot quicker for if you need to do a heavier cross-section reduction. This is, I think, the longest video in the whole presentation. Now you can see my blows are a little lighter. I'm cleaning and dressing that section. I don't want to reduce the cross section anymore. I like to taper those tabs a little bit just for looks. There's nothing specifically functional about that. Okay, so we'll review real quickly here. You flatten the tip back. If you start with 3/8 round or 1/2 inch, if you're a bit of a masochist. Flatten the tip 1/2 inch back, and you're going to rotate your stock 90 degrees to establish your second plane. Then your next step is to establish the boss by holding the piece about at a 30-degree angle, offside on the edge of the anvil. Then you start lengthening and thinning that end behind that tab, and you shape it a little bit more, taper it, and you repeat until you're where you want to be.
So there was a question recently about whether there was something magic about the 30-degree angle when other angles work.
No, the 30-degree angle, it's one of those things where I didn't decide a 30-degree angle. The 30 degrees is just what I've always done, and it wasn't until I was asked what number or what the measurement of that angle is that I thought, oh, that looks like I'm doing it about 30 degrees. So
close enough.
45 would probably be a little too sharp. So you don't have a whole lot of space there. So a 30 degree also makes sure that that you've got enough material to work, that you don't wind up working off the piece. A 45 might be a little awkward to establish because you don't have enough material there to really cock the piece that far over. If you know what I'm talking, people know what I'm talking about.
A couple of other questions, sort of picking up on things that have come up along the way, is have you made spatulas with slots to make it a little less heavy?
Well, usually weight isn't an issue for the thickness, the 24 gauge that I use. I've thought about slots. I would either need to make a punch or drill and then file, or drill, chisel, then file, and that's going to significantly increase the cost of the spatula, and I don't think I'd move that many of them. So if I could find a punch that I could do it by hand relatively quickly, I would. But I've thought about it, but it's too much labor to really make it worth my time.
Another kind of random question: when you are making your skimmer, you've got an array of holes in there. Do you do those before or after you do the dishing?
I do it after I do the dishing. If I do it before, if you put the holes in before and then dish, you're going to change the size of the holes, and some are going to get smaller, some are going to get bigger depending upon where they are. And I like to maintain the look of a consistent hole.
So final question. Is there an issue, or how big an issue is there with galvanic action? We have steel and copper next to one another, stainless and bronze next to one another, all this other stuff.
There's really no issue. These are not exterior pieces. They're not in constant contact with an electrolyte, in this case, water or chicken soup for that matter. So that usually happens in exterior pieces when there's a constant, when there's a regular presence of an electrolyte, in most cases rainwater. So no, I've never, and I have several utensils hanging in my kitchen. I've never had that problem.
Okay.
So, okay, so we're good, moving on.
That's it, please.
When you set the boss, you can wind up with a little bit of a hot shut. And while it's on mild steel, you're gonna wax this later. It's really not an issue, but I've started to get a little bit more particular as I've gotten older, so I like to file that out. I'll usually file it out a little hot. I have a bunch of slightly worn, older files that I keep around and are labeled as hot files. So I get rid of that relatively quickly. And give me a second here to find my cursor. There it is. And moving on, and there's that little hot jet usually happens fairly early on. So you can see this really isn't, I really haven't fully worked this piece yet. And here's me working back into the body of the handle. I'm slowly starting to, the planes are sort of shifting here where as I move back, I'm getting wider and thinner from a thicker and more narrow section. And that all has to line up. So that's why it's important to establish those first two planes and establish them as cleanly as you can. So. Okay, the finishing up the handle with the little scroll tail, it's what I call this. If you see here, I'm not overly humble about these, but they are, I think, a nice little scroll going on there, a proper scroll. And I like the way those turn out. First thing you do is it's sort of like when you do the attaching end, you establish the plane, flatten back about a half an inch, 3/4 of an inch, and then you set a shoulder. And you want to make sure that you're in line with the planes on the other end. So, and what I'll often do is I'll do this relatively early on, and then I'll use a pair of tongs. I'll take this to about 1/4 inch square, and then I can use my small tongs, my small wolf jaw, put the tong rings on them, and just work it, holding on to that section, that little nub end for a good part of the time until it's time to spread it, peen this section out here. In video, so you can't quite see, but I think this is me peening out. Yeah. I'm peening out that flared end. And on 1/4 by half, it's already flat, so it's a little easier to visualize. But if you're starting with round stock, you got to make sure to flatten it first. And then I draw it out. You'll see in the video, this gets knocked over, so I can come back, clean up this little angle here. Once you make the eye, as you'll hear me talk about, once you close that eye up, you can't really get in there to clean that little angle up, unless you want to file it. Once you get that eye made, you can't get in there to clean the nothing. You want to make sure it's over the up. Go with a little file, but then you got to go back to color. Okay. And there'll be video of me making this in a second here. These are the stages. Visually, I always like to make sure that this corner is hidden. I like to make sure that this tail pretty much bisects that corner, that edge. Here's me starting that. I'm using I think that's my 4-ounce ball peen. It's a really tiny, taking really light blows. Here I'm going to come down on the side of the wall. And now I go back in the fire. Part of the challenge is making sure that this bisects here. So, little note, I don't like the shape of the horn on my anvil, the round horn, and it would require considerably too much grinding. So I bought that cone mandrel many years ago, and I love that cone mandrel. That cone mandrel is perfect for just that little kind of work. Okay, summary. Here's one step. You flatten that end, then you make your shoulder. You lengthen and taper the end. You peen out the section that your hand is actually holding on to. You dress the angle. Go back and finish drawing out that tail to however long you want. And then you start the little scroll tip and you turn the eye. I think that's pretty good. Everybody with me on that? And now you're ready to assemble. So what I'm doing here is making sure you'll see in a minute here when I put the bend in the spatula. I generally put the bend in right about where the lobe begins. And I want to make sure I've got enough room between the bend and the edge to hide this. I don't want people to see this connecting tab poking out from the other side. It's an aesthetic thing. I think it looks better if the joint is hidden. And I try to make this edge here is fairly straight. Might be a little bit of an arc, but I want to make sure the bend is fairly perpendicular to this edge here. And I put either newspaper or a clean rag in the post vise to keep it from marring that surface. Because at this point, this is finished. And if I get it all scratched up, I may not be able to get those scratches out if they're too heavy. So. And you can see the highly sophisticated bending technique. And you're done. Now, if this bend doesn't come out reasonably perpendicular, it looks cockeyed. It really does look funky. And occasionally when I get it off, I'll throw the piece in the scrap because you can't hammer that out. Once it's bent, that line is in there, that crease is in there. So when you go to finish the handle, first you're going to drill the two little 1/8-inch holes. I use 1/8-inch rivets. You can put that up there. And then you deburr the holes. It'll make it much easier to get the rivets in if you do an ever so slight countersink on them. And then wax. Wax after you put the holes on. If you wax before you put the holes on, before you drill the holes, you'll wind up cooking off some of the wax when you go to do the holes. You'll see in a minute here, I mark the attachment end on the bowl or the spatula blade. I start with the rivet closest to the handle, the back edge. You'll see in a second here, and that's due to the hand punch that I used to make that first hole. The throat isn't super deep, and especially on ladles and spoons, the curve prevents it from going back as deeply as I would want for that second hole. And then I set the first rivet. Set the first rivet nice and snug. You want that really well set before you drill for the second rivet. And I'll explain that here in a second when we get to some video. So I've got my 2 little center punch marks in my wood backup piece, my 1/8" bit. Picture the beeswax. I know Victoria loves the shot of the beeswax. You don't need to get the piece really hot to wax. Just a couple hundred degrees to melt it. At most, you should smoke it. If it gets too hot, you'll flame it off, and you'll find out real quickly if you've gotten it too hot. If you smoke the wax, it'll blacken the piece. And don't breathe that smoke. Beeswax smoke is very uncomfortable to get a snoot full of. And here's Victoria's favorite video. See, I'm sticking that underneath. I know. I don't want that smoke in my face. I've taken lungfuls of that, and it really is uncomfortable. It burns. I'm starting to lose my voice here. And then I use a rag and I wipe off any of the excess. You can use a wire brush to kind of brush off any grit or whatever that might be in with the beeswax. This is usually where I burn myself because the rag slips or the piece slips, or I do 2 or 3 coats of beeswax. That beeswax coating is actually quite durable. On occasion where I've had to remove it in the shop, I have to bring the piece up to about a full red to burn it all off. Otherwise, it gets into the pores, and a good 2 or 3 coats will really last a while. So let me make sure. Oh, okay, we're doing fine on time here. Okay, now I'm getting ready to attach the end. I do this all pretty much just sight it by eye, center it. And I've got a little scratch awl. That scratch awl is the one we all lose from our tri-squares. I managed to save one and not lose it. And then I put a little mark, and then I go back with a Sharpie and put a black dot on the scratch, because the throat of my punch will throw a shadow that I'll lose the scratch mark. And the first thing I do is I put a little dimple from the punch, and that lets me know that I'm where I want to be. This is my little Whitney hand punch. I've had it for about 20 years. They have several different size punches, and I can't tell you the thickness range off the top of my head, but it works fine for everything I punch. This was probably about $50 25 years ago, so I'm sure they're not terribly cheap now. And I use it all the time. It is an invaluable part of my toolkit for kitchen utensils. I run on a generator at my shop, so the more work I can do without having to fire up the generator, the better. So I never just do one utensil. If I'm making utensils, I'm making at least 5 to 10 minimum at a time. So I go through all the same steps. I'll punch all the first holes and get all those first rivets set. Trim the rivets. These are fence pliers. Excuse me. Barbed wire fence pliers. Inherited them from my mother. I like to talk about them. Trims the rivet to like just the perfect size. You can trim up to a 3/16 mild steel rivet. It's a little bit of work, but you can do it. When you set your rivet, make sure the head is on the sheet metal side. You want that shoulder is what's going to secure the sheet metal. And then set the rivet. I'm not actually resting the stainless on the edge of the anvil, on the face of the anvil. It's the head of the rivet. So there's very little chance I'm actually going to scratch up that stainless. You got to make sure you've got it set just right, but it shouldn't be a problem. And then set and then I come back and set the other side. You want to make sure that's really snug, because when you go to drill, there's no center punch mark here. So if this rivet isn't snug enough, the piece will walk all over. And if this gets kicked over and the drill starts to dig in, there's really no way to fix it. And you'll wind up with the spatula blade or the spoon being cockeyed. And sometimes it's so bad you can't compensate by adjusting the handle. Every once in a while, I've had to chisel off rivets and start again. All right, here's the second rivet. And we're ready to flip something.
So a question came up. When you punch your spatula blade for that first rivet, do you go exactly 1/8 of an inch or make it bigger or whatever?
No, yeah, it's so, yes, it's exactly, the punch is exactly 1/8 of an inch, as far as I know. I haven't mic'd it out. Steel rivets, I think, tend to run slightly undersized. Excuse me. And copper and brass rivets, I'm pretty sure run right on size. So on occasion, I usually don't have a problem, but if I do, I have a little tapered hand reamer. If you don't have one, I really suggest getting one. They're only usually like $10, and they're really handy to have. Just stick the taper hand reamer, couple of turns, and it gives you don't need a lot of room. You don't need really that much clearance. So I hope that addressed that question. Ladle or spoon, I don't know what that necessarily is referring to, but here we see a collection of some of my utensils. Okay, we'll touch a little bit on dishing the ladles. And somebody had a question, I think, earlier about cracking. One of the ways you avoid cracking is, one, making sure you're not hammering or dishing it too far into a work hardened state. You'll feel it. You'll feel when the copper or the bronze starts to work harden. The sound will change, the feel will change. It'll stop moving so easily, and you'll tell you're just not making the same progress. So you go back in and yield it. And if you're not using stock that's too thin, there's very little chance you'll crack. You just got to pay attention. You can use, I dish with a dishing stump. You'll see a picture of my dishing stump in a second. If you're going to use a dishing stump, you can use a metal hammer, because your backup material is relatively soft. It's wood. It's relatively easy to make your own dishing stump. You can start you can take a piece of mild steel and make a disc, if you want to do a mild steel ladle, and dish it hot and burn it into the stump. Or you can shell out the money for one of those sort of chainsaw blade type things for 4.5-inch grinders, and essentially carve it in. You can use a swedge block. If you use a metal swedge block, there's a real good chance you're going to need to finish the inside of the swedge block bowl. Those are generally fairly rough castings, and that texture will show up on the outside of the ladle. So get a die grinder, buy whatever, and take some burrs and some stones and polish out the inside of your swedge blocks dishing bowl. If you're going to use a swedge block, then your hammer needs to be softer. That's how you avoid thinning the material, and again, how you're going to avoid cracking it. That's why I would never dish with a metal hammer into a metal swedge. You're going to wind up thinning that material. So I use plastic hammers, or you can use a wooden hammer or a rawhide hammer. Just make sure that the hammer is softer than the swedge. There's my dishing stump, high tech. I don't know what the wood is. The harder the wood, the better off you are. It'll be a little bit more work to make, but it'll live longer. Eventually, these will get so deep that I can't really use them. So I'll wind up having, this is my second or third dishing stump. It's my little dishing hammer. I made that. That was the first hammer I ever made. And there's the two plastic hammers. I got those from Harbor Freight. They're relatively cheap and they're very nice to use. Raising stake. I don't use a raising stake too much anymore. Mainly on shovel blanks when I need to clean up a section. This is a cleaned up modified ball hitch, and I use this for setting the rivets, to back up the rivets for the spoons and the ladles. Since those are dished, I need to have something rounded to back up the rivet when I set the rivet. And those work nicely. So I start with, there's my 4-inch or might be 4.5-inch copper disc. That's fully annealed. I start from the center and work around in circles towards the edge. This is one of the few places where you run the risk of really smacking your thumb. And it doesn't take more than just a little bit of a glancing blow to cause considerable pain. Those hollows in that stump aren't symmetrical, so I turn the piece around to make sure I'm getting an even work. And the one on the left is after 1 or 2 dishing courses, and the one on the right is a little closer to being fully finished. And so that started as 4, and you can see it finished up. I lost about 1/4 of an inch. How deep you go is up to you, and how wide you want to go. Again, whatever the size. If you're making these for yourself, if you want to make a little gravy ladle, go for it. If you want to make a big gravy ladle, go for it. I polish all the surfaces with that should say maroon. I wasn't able to either. I start with the maroon, whatever reason I didn't change that. Just a reminder, you can put it in the drill press no faster than 3,000. The other little minor adjustment is that little tab is going to have to be curved to match the back of the ladle or the spoon. Otherwise, the process is the same as the spatula. And just one more little option here to tease folks, which would probably be a whole nother, will maybe eventually be a whole nother presentation, is forks. Forks are generally one-piece forgings. You need a hot cut chisel and a fuller. And I think that's it. Okay, so I wanted people to see this. This is a set I made after I'd been smithing for 2 years. Thereabouts, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. It's one of the first full sets I made and sold. So I can sit here and pick it apart, but generally you can see it's a little on the rough side. Find my cursor again here. Fork is kind of gangly looking. The edges of the ladle bowl aren't very even. The spoon shape, as far as I'm concerned, is kind of a mess. And there's no boss on the backs of any of these. And I stopped using this shape years ago, and it's really not that big. So everybody starts out rough. It took me about probably pushing at least a good 10 years of smithing before I was able to make something as nice as the Calla set. And there's the Calla set with the wall hanger. And I think I mentioned those stamens are forged brazed in. And I think it's another shot. Okay, little repetitive. That's the word I'm looking for. Now we're pretty well done. Hold on, we want to go back and see if folks want to throw some more questions at me. Let's see what time we got here. We got time for a few questions. We're about 10 to 8. Paul?
So Francis, how about if you stop sharing and we just let everyone come back on and can have a little chat?
Okay, thank you, Victoria.
That was awesome. Thank you, Francis.
You're welcome.
So everyone should be able to unmute themselves.
Okay.
Unmuted.
Okay,
There we go.
Who we got there? Pat. Hi, Pat.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. Thank you. Did you have a question, sir?
I don't.
Okay.
I've got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
What angle do you generally bend your spatulas to? Like, what's a good angle?
Whatever looks good to you. Whatever looks good to me. A lot of the numbers I've come up with for the classes and the presentation are essentially backtracking and me thinking, okay, this is what I've been doing for years. What number is this actually? It's a visual. The nice thing about the stainless is, and I do this frequently with my spatulas at home, is I'll wind up pushing harder and I intentionally bend the spatula a little tighter and then just bend it back later. So you can adjust them as you go along. It's not a problem to change that angle later. Jim, did you have your center stage on my thing here? So did you have a question, sir?
No, I don't. I
Okay.
really enjoyed the presentation, though. And
thank you. I'm glad. I'm hoping folks have gotten something out of this. It'll be nice when we can go back to doing this in person.
So you're talking about basically passivating stainless steel
Yes.
in a non-pickling method. You said using by abrading it. What's your process on that to, like, say, get a stainless steel ladle handle to ready?
I was using muriatic acid. My research and sort of communicating with other smiths is nitric is really the preferred acid for that, because you want to encourage the chrome oxides, or is it chromium oxide? I can never remember, excuse me. You want to encourage the formation of those on the surface, because that's what gives you your corrosion resistance and cleans the iron oxides off. So I threw them in a bucket full of slightly diluted muriatic acid, and then I neutralized it. And then if I did any other surface treatment, I would wire wheel it. And if you wire wheel, you have to use a stainless steel wire wheel. If you use a regular steel wire wheel, the steel from the non-stainless wire wheel will rub off and you'll begin to rust. So that's generally my process for those. And
I meant, sorry, that you said besides pickling, you had a process to braid them. Like, do you like a Scotch-Brite pad or something, and that would get it to stainless?
You would need to go back and either file the entire thing or hit it on a belt sander.
Oh, okay. To get it to shiny without to get all the forged surfaces off.
Yeah, you want to clean all that fire scale.
Okay.
Some folks have told me that if you quench it, you can get that same effect as passivating or grind. You keep it from rusting. I've never done it, but I have been told by at least a couple smiths that they've had perfectly acceptable results with just quenching it from like a cherry or an orange. But again, I tend to err on the side of caution. I'm selling these, so I don't want to risk someone coming back and going, my stainless, my $125 ladle is rusting, and you said it wasn't going to rust.
Yeah.
So remember, stainless is rust resistant.
Right, right.
Okay,
They'll
and then
call it
Anna had a
stain-
question, and then I think Lyndon.
Okay.
Yeah, mine was about
Anna-
the depth of your bowls when you
Yeah.
dish them. What do you find like sells the most? Like a deeper dish, and like about how much you generally dish them
I
to?
generally dip, so again, I don't vary the dishing generally. The hemispheres I all dish out to approximately the same. I don't know what the depth is. I've never measured it. It's just what I've been, I go by eye. Oh, that looks about deep enough. I want to maintain usually a fairly hemispherical rather than a parabolic sort of. If you get much deeper, if you go real deep on a disc, you're going to start to develop more of a parabolic look. And if that's what you're after, cool, that's fine. That's not what I go for.
So
But go ahead. Sorry, Paul.
yeah, there was a question. I guess it was Tina doesn't seem to be able to unmute. Maybe she can now.
Okay. Tina, you there?
How you do the calla lilies? Is there a whole separate section on that?
The calla lily. So yeah, a calla lily utensil from just doing the handle is probably a good 2 hours. And it would it would be pretty much almost another presentation, because there's forge brazing involved, which involves a whole bunch of other steps and techniques, and even just making the calla, forging out the calla without the stamen takes a considerable amount of time to get that kind of spread on that little bit of material. There's a lot of peening and a lot of little tap, tap, tap hammering.
So that really brings up the next question, which is, of the people here, would you raise your hands if you'd like a part 2 of this with more dishing, more different utensils, more techniques? Who would be interested in,
it would probably also involve
$20 for that?
I think we have a majority.
It would involve, I would imagine it would involve a little bit more of the spoon and the ladle, and definitely the fork as well.
So I have a question, Francis. Where do you do your research for the?
Hold on, hold both. You give a second.
2 seconds. Lyndon had a question. He had his hand up. He was patiently waiting.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll kind of go off of a little bit of what Anna was talking about there with the bowls on the ladles. I was trying to do a bowl, but I was using a mild steel, and I was doing it hot in the wooden stump. But what was happening is I was getting the edges of it were rippling a lot on me. Could you touch on what was happening there, how I could avoid that?
Thank you. Well, that would go more into the other, essentially part 2. But when you're dishing, getting those ripples happens. When they happen, you have to knock them down when they're big, because if they get too tight and too tiny, you'll never fully get them out, and you'll always have a little bit of that ridge. So as soon as you can, as those show up, it's a back and forth process, sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. You're constantly working those ripples down, because it's part of the process. So you got to stay on top of the ripples. And then if you're going to do steel, what you can do at the end is make yourself a raising stake and then planish them out a little bit more later.
Great. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that sounds exactly like what I was working with. I just probably need to work at it a little bit more. It seemed like a very tedious task that it seemed like you were saying 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And
yeah, it's you're going back and forth. You're doing exactly what you got to do. You just got to stay on top of them. Again, don't let them get too tight and too tiny, or else you'll never really get them out.
Great. Thank you very much, Francis. I also just touch on the stainless steel. I know that another option that you can use for passivating is citric acid, which is
yes, I've done a little bit, because in the welding industry, passivation is a huge concern and a huge issue in stainlesses. Yeah. So and they've developed, I know, industry and the environmental side of things. They've wanted more friendly passivation, passivating substances. Word retrieval, middle age, I love it. And I've seen the citric acids. I've never used them, and I don't know how well they would work on a large scale. I've only ever seen them used in reference to doing weld beads and smaller surface areas.
No, it's actually, I'm a TIG welder by trade. I do stainless steel on a regular basis, and bathing it in citric acid is a very good way to go about things. With the muriatic acid and stuff like that, you're playing with some really dangerous stuff, and you should actually be using a neutralizing acid when you're done with it to prevent any harm. Yeah,
I do neutralize. I soak everything in baking soda and water to neutralize. I left that step out. Pardon me. But yeah, no, you always got to neutralize anything you soak in acid. You have to neutralize. So, right. Thank you. Thank you for bringing up the citric acid. I didn't realize you could use it on that large a surface area.
Oh, thank you very much, Francis.
You're welcome.
So a question that came up way earlier is, where do you buy materials? Can you use drops? Where do you find drops?
Yes, you can use drops. That's determined by how much material you need. As far as where you're going to get your material, you're going to have to Google suppliers in your area, which, you know, here in Davis, in the Sacramento area, there used to be 2 or 3 places, and they've all gone away. And now I order everything from either from the Bay Area, or there's one Bronze or somebody, I think, in Denver. So you just have to go online and find where the closest supplier is to you. If you've got a surplus place, the only concern is making sure you know that if you're buying copper, it's just plain copper, or if you're going to buy bronze or brass, knowing that it's a workable alloy. So that's the upside of buying from directly from a supplier, is you know exactly what you're getting, and they'll often have drops. You can ask them, do you if they keep track of their drops. So now, Bo or somebody had a question about my research.
I was just asking for the best resource to do some research on what to use on copper and any other metals to make it food safe. I've done a little bit, but I haven't come up with very many answers. So
have you done tinning?
No.
Have you researched tinning? So tinning is the traditional way of coating the inside of copper for copper pans. You can even see occasionally old copper pans will show up that need to be retinned after decades and decades of use. You shouldn't need to retin a copper pan that often. If you do, then somebody didn't tin it very properly the first time. I've never tinned. I know the only smith I know who's done tinning off the top of my head is Jake Kidwell, and I think we have somebody here who's done tinning, don't we?
Pat, I would imagine.
Pat?
Yeah, I did.
Pat, can you speak to the tinning?
I did it at the last conference, and I wouldn't.
Yeah,
I wouldn't suggest it unless you absolutely had to. I've also done it on copper for a chocolate pot from 1800 that I did for the state. It's a pain in the neck.
At the very least, now you introduced me to a tinning compound that's the tin and the flux in one compound. No,
correct. It's in one package, and it's food grade. Okay. You have to be very, very careful because there's other tinnings that are not food grade.
Okay.
But
thank you.
I don't think I would want to run around and sell my tinned pieces for food product.
Really?
Yeah, that's just personal
liability, CYA.
Yeah, because people scrape it out.
Oh yeah.
before we started selling stainless steel mixing bowls, they were steel bowls that were tinned, and the whip inside the mixing bowl, commercial ones, would knock out the tin and it would end up in the food.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Okay.
If I can ask real quick, why were you tinning mild steel bowls? Were they mild
The
steel?
way it was done for maybe 100 years, all your
Oh.
bakery with their big mixers that are taller than you,
Yeah.
150-gallon mixing bowl.
And this is true stainless steel.
Right.
Okay.
And all of the chocolate that you eat, most of it, is made in solid copper kettles.
Right, which have to be tinned.
Yeah.
Pat, what's the compound?
I would have to run out in the shop. I don't remember the name of it.
I think Amy Pay carries it. I've seen it online.
She does, but if you want to email me later, I'll
email
go
you.
look at it and I'll.
No worries.
Yeah.
I have an antique Turkish brick for making coffee that's lost a seam and leaks now, and I want to retin it. So
Well, the only issue we ran into when we did it for the convention is we bought, I think, 6 pounds. Each container is a pound, because that was the same price for hazard materials shipping as it was to buy 1 pound and have it shipped.
I remember that story.
So that's another issue.
Linda, did you have a question?
Anybody else have a question?
More? Yeah, I was wondering, you've got it listed as 304 stainless that you're using for your main material. What about using 309 or 316 or a 400 series?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, the 300 is the austenitic, non-magnetic
I'm talking
series.
to this gentleman. Okay.
And when you're dealing with food grade, it's the 300 series. I've never used 316. I think it's a little bit more expensive. And I've never heard of the 309, to be honest. And I use the 304 because it's cheaper, and the 316, is my understanding, is used more often when electropolishing is wanting to be done. So the 304 was just a convenient food grade quality stainless that was available to me. And I've never heard of 309. And the 400 series, if it's not non-magnetic, I wouldn't be inclined to use it because it'll attract and hold dust potentially. Most food grade stainlesses are through the 300 series, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, the food grade series would be in the 300 series for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, 308, 309 is common in the welding industry.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not nearly that familiar with welding.
You get fancy and use some 17-4 stainless.
Okay, now you're just making up numbers.
Oh no, look it up. It's real.
Okay, I believe it.
Well, there's all sorts of different stainlesses that the knife community is using, like the ABLs or the Nitro V, right?
Oh, now I'm just barely just starting to play with knives, and now you're getting into even more exotic.
Now this is just mudslinging for Francis.
If you use the fancy stainless, you don't have to drop the point of your chopping knife, your chef's knife.
Tanto, not drop point.
Oh, there's Becky. Hi, Becky.
Hi, Francis.
You just showed up. I hope this was a good refresher for you.
It was great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Becky's had the class in person at Adams Forge down in LA.
And hopefully we'll be able to do those again.
Hopefully next year at the earliest, definitely. I know though, I'm not going anywhere until next year as far as crowds go.
Well, hey, I've got to say that I very much appreciate that you guys are doing this via Zoom, because I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and there's no way I'm coming out there to swing hammers with you guys. So
I think we could tell you were from Canada, Lyndon. It's okay.
Can I say a couple times?
No, I have a client who's from Canada. The accent is definitely there.
Nice.
Well,
So
keep
any
looking
other-
for more. We're working on more, and it sounds like we need to get Francis recruited for a couple more. And
I'm going to need at least a T-shirt or something here. There's a lot of work on these. I think Greg and I need at least a case of something or some pizza for motivation.
I think I still think there's some Ferndale T-shirts.
Oh, we got a pile of those.
Yeah, we could do that. No, Francis is volunteering his time, and we're very grateful for that.
Well,
I can get you an orange beanie for safety.
It's okay.
I'll knit you a hat. How's that?
How about
Lyndon sent him a toque?
There we go.
Give me one of the Reuben Haberman's coffee cups. I wouldn't say no to one of those.
I might have.
That can be arranged.
Okay. I'd love one of those.
Have a Manitoba Blacksmith Guild T-shirt I could send your way.
Ooh, send it to me. I did all the video and photos.
Volunteering your time, Greg, right?
The extra money for customs shipping across international lines is a pain. So any other questions? Not that I'm not having fun, but I know it's a little bit past 8 o'clock, and I'm sure we don't want to run too over here.
Well, if there's no other questions, thank you so much, Francis. This was excellent.
Yeah, did a great job. You. Did a great job.
Wonderful. Thank you, Francis.
My pleasure.
But
and thanks everybody for your great questions and patience. The questions are fantastic. Again, if you're not sure or want to know, throw the question out there and we'll get it answered.
Yeah, you can always throw questions out on the Facebook page for the CBA. Don't be shy. That's what that page is there for. And I got no problem answering questions if you got a follow-up question about this. So
there will be a bit of a handout for the folks here. So if you missed taking notes on which thickness of material you need, that'll be in there. A couple of other things. It won't be the whole presentation because, well, that's just kind of too much. But once again, thanks a lot. And look forward to other Zooms that we're putting together.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. All right, take care, everybody.
Later.
Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you again.
Bye, all. Thanks, Greg.